Tonight on Nightline, behind the rampage, what drove this family man to kill his wife and son, and then himself. The killer's distraught father sits down with Bob Woodruff for his first interview, with new details on what he believes pushed his son over the edge. An ABC News exclusive. Plus, the wake of a gruesome tragedy. A husband, wife, and their young child dead, an apparent double murder-suicide. When police found steroids on the scene, many assume that explained it. The killer had flipped out because of drug use. Or might there be another explanation? The killer's father has embarked on a mission to find an answer, and he sat down with Bob Woodruff for an ABC News exclusive.
Oh boy, here come down. Chris Benoit, the wrestler, was an enormous public success with a career spanning decades. He was one of the most popular performers of his generation. To those who knew him privately, Chris Benoit also appeared to be a devoted family man.
He was a very kind, what you saw in the ring was not the Chris Benoit on the outside. He loved to be at home playing with his children. That's where he wanted to be.
So when Chris's father, Michael, first learned of his son's death, the gruesome details made no sense.
He phoned me on Father's Day, which was a week before. And I said, you know, how are you going? What are you doing? And he said, unfortunately, Dad, I'm on the road. It's Father's Day today. I wish I was home with my family. So, a week later, we end up with this tragedy.
Behind those closed doors this June, Chris Benoit did the unthinkable.
The wife was bound on her feet and I think also on her wrists.
Over 3 days, he strangled his wife, suffocated his 7-year-old son, then killed himself. Are you shocked to this day of specifically what happened?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We would have never dreamt that Chris was capable of doing this.
Plagued by grief and unanswered questions, Michael Benoit received a surprising phone call.
It was 4 days after the tragedy that Chris Nowinski of the Sports Legacy Institute contacted me.
I told him I think there was something worth investigating. That I thought brain injuries may have played a role in what happened, and it was worth doing the studies.
What did you think about it then?
I was grasping for anything. The world was very black. I mean, we didn't even know how to deal with this.
A former professional wrestler, Chris Nowinski, has dedicated himself to studying the long-term effects of concussions after struggling with the effects of his own multiple concussions.
I didn't know that I needed to rest my concussion when I got it. So for 3 weeks, I kept wrestling night after night with bad headaches and a fog every night, and made that one a lot worse.
Nowinski knew he couldn't be the only athlete suffering in this way. He remembers, in fact, talking to Chris Benoit about the concussions they both had sustained in the ring.
The reason that I really wanted to look into this case was because Chris had told me that, you know, we talked about our concussion histories, that he had more than he could count.
So far, his Sports Legacy Institute has studied the brains of 4 former NFL players who committed suicide. They say they found brains so damaged from multiple concussions, they resembled those of Alzheimer's patients. They believe the brain damage and the resulting dementia may be an important factor in the suicides and possibly even homicide.
The problem here, and sort of the lesson here, is that I don't think any of us prior to very recently have realized that concussions can affect your brain in such a drastic way at such a young age.
With this new information, Benoit's family agreed to allow scientists to study Chris's brain.
When we did an examination on his brain, what we found was very similar to what we found in 4 previous NFL players.
That's a different type.
Dr. Julian Bales examined Chris Benoit's brain using a protein stain that highlights areas of trauma. It is evidence, Bales says, of a condition called CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. As far as you know, it was the concussion to the brain that created this damage?
It was multiple traumatic injuries, yes.
After the toxicology report found steroids in Benoit's system, speculation began that roid rage might have been behind what happened that fateful weekend.
There's no consensus in the medical community that this issue of roid rage, uncontrolled violence, precipitated by seemingly normal life stressors, there's no consensus that that even exists. The changes that we see in his brain tissue are not caused by steroids. There's no medical evidence or research that's ever shown that anabolic steroids cause those dead neurons. Some people would even say that steroids are good for the brain, that they support the brain. They don't destroy it.
Everyone is pointing to steroids and drug abuse. It's my feeling now that it's much more than that, that it's brain injury that has been causing these problems in the wrestling community.
Brain injury and steroids, but could that lead to murder? There are actually a lot of people who say, look, and he killed somebody, killed his child, his wife, and then committed suicide. Is that what happens to people when they have brain problems, injuries?
I think we don't have the answer.
When we come back, the effort to answer that very question. We return now to Bob Woodruff's report on the search for what may have driven the professional wrestler Chris Benoit to kill his wife and son, and then himself. We resume with an intriguing question. Did the blows to the head Benoit received in the wrestling ring fundamentally change his brain?
Like Chris Benoit.
The get back in the game mentality of professional athletes can make brain injury prevention difficult.
I got elbowed in the head and I had double vision, and I refused to tag back in until my vision cleared.
And after you did that, did you go back and wrestle again quickly?
I finished the match. I got back in as soon as my vision cleared up.
Concussions often go undiagnosed and sometimes even undetected by those who suffer them, making it all the more difficult to study long-term effects. How many concussions would you allow before you gave advice?
Our research in football players is it seems to be a cutoff at 3. That with 3 or more major or noted concussions, that's where the risk really begins. In Chris's brain, we see multiple areas.
Researchers that studied the brains of NFL players and now that of wrestler Chris Benoit believe all the athletes showed the same disturbing behavior pattern, seemingly happy dispositions turned sour, then severe depression, and finally suicide.
We certainly were aware, or have been made aware of some issues that he was having from some neighbors and that, of some strange behavior that was going on.
When I had heard that Chris had placed Bibles next to the body, that actually did raise red flags in my head, because a few of our prior cases had become very religious, where they had not been at the end of their lives.
The implications of scientific findings are startling, but connecting the evidence of brain damage to homicidal behavior is precarious business. Do you believe, as a doctor, that the condition of his brain, the way you discovered it, had an impact on what he did when he killed 2 people and committed suicide?
That's a very hard question to answer, and the workings of the human brain, especially when violence of that type is carried out, I don't think anybody in science or medicine knows. But I do think, to answer your question, that it did have a major impact, and I think there are other cases where this sort of brain damage does have very abnormal, uncharacteristic behavior, extreme behavior, leading to suicide.
And Chris Benoit's trademark, violent antics in the ring, certainly didn't help.
But I think by now everyone's seen the pictures of him jumping off the ladder and jumping off the top rope and being hit over the head with chairs. And so none of that is good.
There's a major safety issue in the wrestling industry today.
Much bad blood between these 2 guys.
When you start introducing ladders and tables and chairs, that's real. I asked him one time, I said, when you get hit in the head with a chair, does it hurt? He said, you're damn right it does, Dad.
Are you angry about what happened to him during his wrestling life?
Yes. Let me put it this way. The company that I work for, the number one priority of the person that owns the company is the health and safety of the people that work in the company. I wish that the same could be said for the company that Chris worked for.
We contacted World Wrestling Entertainment for a response. They sent along a statement saying the analysis that concussions might have led to Benoit's murderous rampage was speculative, and went on to say, "We respect the desire of that father to do whatever he can to find some explanation."
Wrestling has got completely out of hand. It's really not a true form of wrestling. They've brought in what they call this hardcore for the shock effect now. If you get hit in the head with a chair often enough, in the end, it's going to cause problems.
Michael Benoit is asking the question that every parent who has lost a child to suicide asks, why? And perhaps he has found his answer. But one truth is painfully evident.
He was a kind and gentle man. We got to remember that this story isn't only about my son. We lost our daughter-in-law. We lost our grandson. Parents shouldn't have to bury their children.
Bob Woodruff with a tragic story and the search for answers. When we come back, behind the scenes on the